Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the distant past, into a time when China was a land torn by war and ambition. The year is 230 BCE. Imagine yourself on the battlefield, surrounded by the noise of clashing swords, the smell of sweat, and the cries of soldiers, some victorious, others already fallen. You can almost taste the tension in the air as the ancient states of China are fighting not only for land, but for their very survival. You might be thinking, that's a lot of fighting. Are we sure it's safe for me to be here right now? Trust me, it's touch and go. The battles were fierce, the stakes were high, and survival wasn't guaranteed. But don't worry, we're in this together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you want to, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always nice to know where everyone's at in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. China, as we know it today, didn't always exist as one unified country. In fact, before the Qin dynasty's rise to power in the late 3rd century BCE, the region was anything but unified. It was a world split into several warring states, each constantly vying for power, wealth, and control. You see, this was the period known as the Warring States period, and it had been dragging on for hundreds of years. By the time 230 BCE rolled around, China's political landscape was like a battlefield of ideas, alliances, betrayals, and of course, warfare. There were 7 dominant states: Qi, Chu, Yan, Zhao, Wei, Han, and Qin, each with their own ambitions, tactics, and strengths. The situation was a bit like a game of chess, but with a lot more blood. The states' rulers would often form temporary alliances, only to break them later, in pursuit of dominance over the others. A fragile peace existed, but it was always broken by one side seeking to gain an advantage. Yet, amidst this chaos, one state, Qin, was quietly positioning itself to become the most powerful of them all. The Qin were relentless, their ambition as grand as it was terrifying, and they had something that the other states lacked: a ruler with a vision to unite them all under a single banner. But, before we get into the thrilling rise of Qin, let's take a quick moment to understand what the world looked like before this unification. What did these warring states really mean for the people? The world back then wasn't just about armies clashing on open fields. It was also about the everyday lives of the people. Picture a peasant in one of these warring states. The sun beats down on their back as they toil away in the fields. Maybe they're growing rice, or maybe they're tending to a herd of cattle. Their life was harsh, always at the mercy of warlords who could send them to battle at a moment's notice. If they were lucky, they'd be spared from the chaos. If not, they'd be conscripted into the army, a fate many met with little chance of survival. For the nobility and the military elite, life was equally uncertain, though the stakes were far higher. Alliances could crumble overnight, and your closest ally could quickly turn into your deadliest enemy. These were the people who played the political game, making moves on the chessboard, sometimes sacrificing lives for their own advancement or that of their state. The game wasn't just about power, it was about survival. But within all of this, one state, the Qin, was ready to make its move. With its well-organized military and a ruler determined to bring the fractured world together, the unification of China wasn't just a possibility, it was becoming an inevitability. So how did the Qin, a relatively small and often overlooked state, come to dominate the rest? Well, that's where things get interesting. The story of their rise to power is filled with moments of brilliance, but also ruthlessness. But for now, let's take a moment to step back and marvel at how fragile this ancient world really was, how a single state could change the entire course of history with enough ambition and determination. Now that you've got a sense of the chaotic, fractured world that existed before the Qin unification, let's take a closer look at the state of Qin itself. At this point, it's still just one of the many competing kingdoms, but something's brewing there, something different. The Qin were on a fast track to power, and while they might have seemed like just another one of the warring states, they were playing the long game. They had a vision. A vision of an empire, one that would unite all the fragmented kingdoms of China under one rule. That vision would soon be realized, but it wasn't going to happen without some serious planning and some brutal, calculated moves. Let's talk about leadership for a second. As we all know, great power often hinges on having the right leader at the helm. And for Qin, that leader was King Zheng, who would later go on to be known as Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Before we get all grandiose, though, let's take a moment to consider who this guy really was, because he wasn't your typical king. King Zheng, born in 259 BCE, was not like the other rulers of his time. To put it simply, he was driven. His rise to power came after a very complicated and, let's be honest, somewhat dubious series of events. He was born to the king of Qin, but his early years weren't exactly the picture-perfect royal upbringing. In fact, he was actually put on the throne at a pretty young age, around 13 years old, after his father's sudden death. The thing is, his rise to power wasn't without complications. Political intrigue, internal betrayal, and even some familial conflict plagued his early years as ruler. But, even as a teenager, there was something about Zheng that hinted he was different. He wasn't just another kid on a throne. He had ambition, and that ambition would soon become a driving force that reshaped China's future. By the time Zheng took the reins, the Qin state had already laid a solid foundation for future conquest. Qin was known for its military strength, but what really set it apart was its adaptability and willingness to embrace new ideas. Zheng's reign would take that to the next level. He didn't just inherit power, he took it and molded it into something entirely new. To understand just how revolutionary his leadership was, let's break down the factors that helped Qin succeed where others failed. First off, Zheng was a master of military strategy. But what made him particularly formidable was his ability to think outside of the box. He understood that brute force alone wouldn't guarantee victory. Instead, he made sure the Qin military was built around efficiency and discipline. The army was highly trained, highly organized, and most importantly, they were loyal. The Qin didn't just throw soldiers into battle, they forged a fighting force that was as disciplined as it was brutal. This wasn't just about fighting, it was about winning, and winning meant eliminating anything that stood in your way. But here's where it gets interesting. While Zheng was a brilliant strategist, he also understood the importance of a strong political structure. It wasn't enough to just be a good general. He needed a solid foundation to support his military ventures. This is where his key advisor, Li Si, comes into play. You might not have heard much about Li Si before, but trust me, this guy was instrumental in Qin's rise to power. Li Si was a legalist, someone who believed in strict, centralized control and harsh punishments. While legalism may sound a bit intense, and, okay, maybe a little scary, it was exactly what Qin needed. Legalism gave them the structure and the authority to act quickly and decisively. And Zheng, being the forward-thinking ruler he was, saw the potential in this philosophy. He didn't shy away from using it to consolidate his power. He needed to get rid of corruption, inefficiency, and disloyalty if he was going to succeed. So, the combination of a strong military and a tough political system created a framework that was nearly unstoppable. Now, here's the kicker. Unlike other rulers who depended on traditional alliances and strategies, King Zheng had no hesitation when it came to hard decisions. If there were obstacles, he removed them. If the old ways of doing things didn't work, he was quick to abandon them. This ruthless, no-nonsense approach worked wonders, but it also earned him a reputation. Let's just say people weren't exactly in love with him at first. In fact, many of his contemporaries thought he was a bit too extreme. But, while the other states were busy waging their own petty wars and bickering over who had the best territory, Qin was focused. They were a machine, slowly gearing up for something bigger. So, you might be thinking, okay, so this guy's ambitious. But what did he actually do to set the stage for Qin's domination? Well, the answer is simple. Zheng started with a series of calculated military campaigns. They weren't random or impulsive, they were part of a broader strategy to systematically dismantle the other warring states. One of his first big moves was to strengthen the borders of Qin. By securing his own territory, he was able to focus on attacking weaker states without worrying about his own security. He also employed clever diplomacy, offering alliances with other states when it suited his goals. But when alliances didn't work, he didn't hesitate to break them and press forward with military force. But perhaps the most important part of Zheng's rise was the belief that China's unification could be achieved through power and force, rather than through diplomacy alone. He wasn't afraid to fight. And he wasn't afraid to win, no matter the cost. The other states may have underestimated him at first, but they wouldn't make that mistake for long. With the groundwork laid for the battles to come, the stage was set for King Zheng's rise to become the ruler of a unified China. But first, he had to deal with the ever-looming threat from his neighbors. The upcoming wars would not only be brutal but would shape the course of history forever. So as you drift deeper into tonight's journey, remember, this isn't just a story of battles and bloodshed. It's a tale of ambition, power, and what it takes to reshape an entire world. So, now you know a bit about King Zheng, the ruler with the vision to unify China, and his brilliant military and political maneuvering. But what made him more than just a great strategist was the sheer force of his personality. His determination to build an empire was unstoppable. Even as a young king, he wasn't content with ruling just his state, he wanted to dominate all of China. And it's that kind of hunger for power that drives this story forward. But to truly understand how Zheng would pull off this grand feat, we need to dig a little deeper into his character. He wasn't a ruler who played by the rules, at least not by the standards of his contemporaries. Zheng didn't just want to conquer, he wanted to reshape the very concept of what it meant to be a ruler. And that meant leaving behind the old ways. No more playing nice with neighboring states. No more operating within the loose, unwritten rules of the warring states period. Zheng's approach to governance was cold, calculated, and relentless. And it was this approach that would set the Qin on the path to domination. Let's take a moment to reflect on the man himself, King Zheng. Imagine him on his throne, not as a distant, untouchable figure, but as a young ruler with something to prove. His mind was sharp, his gaze unwavering, and his ambition was vast. At times, he was a stern and calculating leader, willing to make tough decisions that might alienate allies or family members. But there was another side to him too, a ruler who knew how to inspire loyalty in his soldiers and officials. His charisma was undeniable, even though it was often veiled in the ruthlessness that marked his rule. Zheng wasn't just a king, he was a symbol. He represented something bigger than just one kingdom, he embodied the hope of a unified China, a China free from the constant warring factions that plagued it. And his vision was infectious. People around him began to believe that he was the one who could deliver peace, not through diplomacy, but through absolute power. After all, a powerful ruler could impose order, could make sure no one had the power to challenge him. It was a brutal, yet pragmatic solution to the centuries of chaos. But there was more to Zheng's rule than just ambition and vision. He also had the ability to manage and strategize like few others. He had an almost uncanny ability to turn weaknesses into strengths, to recognize opportunities where others saw only obstacles. This was especially evident when it came to his military campaigns. His army was formidable, not just in numbers, but in tactics. They were well-trained, disciplined, and relentless, traits that would become the hallmark of Qin's war machine. One of the key aspects of Zheng's leadership was his willingness to innovate. While many of the other warring states relied on traditional methods of warfare, Zheng encouraged his generals and soldiers to think outside the box. Whether it was in their use of terrain, their approach to siege warfare, or their use of new technologies, the Qin military was always looking for ways to gain an advantage. This innovative mindset would later serve them well when they began their campaigns of conquest. But it wasn't just the army that Zheng needed to build up. He had to secure his political power as well, and for that, he turned to one of the most influential figures in Qin's history, Li Si. Li Si wasn't just a scholar or advisor. He was the architect of Qin's legalist system, and his ideas would form the backbone of Qin's governance. Legalism was a philosophy that promoted strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain control, and it was exactly what the Qin needed at the time. But what really made Li Si stand out was his ability to implement these ideas across a vast kingdom. While other states had weaker, more disjointed systems of governance, Qin's was centralized and tightly controlled. Every move Zheng made was supported by Li Si's vision of law and order, ensuring that no rebellion or dissent would be tolerated. One of the most famous, and perhaps most controversial, aspects of Li Si's system was the idea of burning books and burying scholars. This was a drastic measure, but it was done to ensure that no competing philosophies or ideas would undermine Qin's authority. Zheng didn't just want to conquer other states, he wanted to control the flow of information and ideas. By eliminating rival philosophies, he ensured that his rule was based on one unified vision. It's easy to criticize this approach in modern terms, but in the context of the time, it was a necessary step for unifying such a vast and diverse territory. But let's not get too caught up in the philosophical implications just yet, let's get back to the wars. Because the real test of Zheng's power, of his ability to unify China, lay in his military campaigns. By now, the Qin were ready to make their move. They weren't just sitting on their laurels, they were preparing for the most important phase of their conquest, the military campaigns that would finally topple the other states and bring China under one rule. And that's where the story of the Qin Unification Wars truly begins. It would be a series of campaigns that would challenge the very notion of what it meant to be a state in ancient China. As we move forward, we'll look at the tactics, the battles, and the crushing inevitability of Qin's dominance. These weren't just military campaigns, they were about reshaping an entire civilization. As you settle into tonight's journey, imagine the dust rising from the battlefield, the thunderous sound of chariots charging, and the tension in the air as these states teetered on the brink of change. It was a world on the edge, and soon, King Zheng would push it over the edge into unification. By now, you're probably beginning to realize just how ambitious King Zheng's plans were. He had built a formidable foundation, but now, it was time for action. He was no longer content to simply consolidate power within his own state, he was preparing to crush the rival kingdoms that had surrounded him for centuries. The world he knew was about to be upended forever. But as we take this journey into the heart of the Qin's military conquests, we have to look at the driving force behind their success, Li Si, the political mastermind who helped shape the foundations of the Qin dynasty. You see, while King Zheng had the ambition and military genius to lead his army, Li Si's influence was essential in ensuring that the kingdom's political and legal structures would hold steady throughout these turbulent times. Li Si was more than just an advisor to King Zheng. He was the chief architect of the Qin state's legalist philosophy. Legalism, as you may remember, was a strict and centralized system of government that prioritized law and order above all else. It was the opposite of the more lenient Confucian or Taoist ideals that permeated other states. Under legalism, laws were harsh, punishments severe, and there was little room for mercy. People were expected to obey not because they believed in the system, but because the consequences of disobedience were too great to ignore. This philosophy was exactly what the Qin needed to solidify their growing power. In a fragmented China, where alliances shifted like sand, legalism gave the Qin the stability they needed to carry out their plans of unification. Li Si's idea was simple but brilliant: absolute control, backed by unwavering law and military might. This wasn't a kingdom built on affection or respect, it was a kingdom built on fear and absolute order. One of Li Si's more drastic measures was his push to standardize various aspects of society. This wasn't just about uniformity for the sake of it, standardization was a powerful tool for control. It allowed the Qin to enforce unity across their vast territory, making everything from currency to writing to measurement standardized. This may not seem like a big deal, but imagine a kingdom where every region spoke different dialects, had different systems of measurement, and used different currencies. It would be chaos. By introducing uniformity, Li Si created a common foundation that allowed the Qin to function as a cohesive unit, even as they expanded. But while standardization was happening in the background, the real action was on the battlefield. The Qin had been preparing for their moment, and now they were ready to strike. The first major campaign would be the conquest of the Chu kingdom. The Chu were one of the largest and most powerful states in the Warring States period. Their territory stretched across vast regions of central and eastern China, and their army was one of the most formidable forces of the time. But the Qin were undeterred. King Zheng, alongside his trusted generals, knew that the fall of the Chu would be a turning point. If they could break the power of the Chu, the other states would soon fall like dominoes. The strategy for defeating the Chu was simple: grind them down. The Qin military was relentless in its approach. Rather than engaging in one massive battle, they utilized a series of calculated strikes, capturing key cities and cutting off supply lines. This wasn't about quick victories, it was about wearing down the enemy over time. While the Chu fought valiantly, they were unable to keep up with the Qin's ability to sustain a long-term campaign. The Qin didn't just have the military edge, they had the resources and the discipline to outlast their enemies. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Chu, despite their vast territory, were not easily defeated. Their generals were shrewd, and the terrain was challenging. In one notable battle, the Qin army found itself trapped in a narrow valley, facing off against an ambush. It seemed like the kind of scenario where a less organized force might have faltered. But the Qin's military training and discipline shone through. They responded with calculated precision, turning what could have been a devastating situation into a victory. This was the kind of flexibility that set the Qin apart from the other states. Still, the Chu were a tough nut to crack. King Zheng, though, wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. As the battles wore on, he kept his focus on the bigger picture, the eventual unification of China. He knew that every victory, no matter how hard won, brought him one step closer to his goal. And the Chu, despite their resistance, were beginning to crumble under the relentless pressure. During this time, Li Si's influence continued to be felt, even if he wasn't on the front lines. His legalist philosophy reinforced the strength of the Qin state in the aftermath of each victory. As the military pushed forward, the legalist policies of strict control were applied to newly conquered lands. The Qin didn't just occupy the cities, they imposed their laws, their system, and their culture, making sure the lands they took were fully integrated into the Qin vision. But the fall of the Chu wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As you drift further into tonight's tale, think about what it must have felt like to witness the steady collapse of one of the most powerful kingdoms in China. The sounds of marching armies, the whispers of generals, and the rustling of soldiers as they prepared for their next move. The Qin were not done. They were only getting started. The momentum was on their side, and soon the other kingdoms would feel the full weight of their ambition. As we move forward, the battles will become even more intense. The strategies, the clever tricks, and the ruthless efficiency of the Qin will unfold before you. It's a story of power, determination, and the kind of ambition that can reshape the entire world. But for now, let's take a moment to savor the feeling of knowing that the Qin were on the rise. It was only a matter of time before they would change the face of history forever. The fall of the Chu was a significant victory for King Zheng and the Qin state, but it was only the first of many. The real challenge was yet to come. After all, while the Chu were strong, they were by no means the only power standing between Qin and total domination of China. As we move deeper into the heart of this story, imagine yourself in the shoes of a general in the Qin army, strategizing, planning, and executing the next wave of conquests. You've already defeated a mighty foe, but there's no time to relax. The next target is waiting. With the Chu out of the way, the Qin turned their attention to the remaining 6 states. It wasn't just a matter of defeating these states in battle. No, King Zheng knew that the key to real unification was more than just military dominance. It was about breaking the will of the other states, showing them that resistance was futile. And that, my friend, is where the brilliance of the Qin military really shone. We're talking about the sheer, overwhelming efficiency of their campaigns. Think about it, when a state like Qin decides to go to war, they don't just roll in with a massive army and hope for the best. No, their military operations were carefully coordinated and meticulously planned. The Qin used speed, surprise, and psychological warfare to break their enemies down before they even knew what hit them. They weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting to dismantle the very will of the states they were conquering. Next on the chopping block. The state of Wei. Wei, a once powerful kingdom, was now struggling to maintain its grasp on power. They had been hit hard by earlier battles, and their military was not as strong as it once was. The Qin capitalized on this weakness, launching a series of fast, precise attacks. The battle strategy was simple: disorient the enemy, cut off reinforcements, and strike at their most vulnerable points. In this case, the Qin targeted the heart of Wei's territory. They began by isolating the Wei capital, attacking vital supply routes and weakening the state's infrastructure. With the Qin army advancing relentlessly from all directions, Wei's defenses quickly began to buckle. This wasn't a campaign of brutal conquest, it was a well-oiled machine that methodically wore down the resistance until there was nothing left but surrender. By the time the Qin reached the Wei capital, the state had already been rendered nearly defenseless. The last resistance crumbled easily, and just like that, the Wei kingdom was no more. But here's where it gets interesting. The Wei didn't just give up without a fight. They tried to rally their forces, call for reinforcements, and stand their ground. In one notable encounter, a Wei general attempted a daring counterattack. But the Qin were always a step ahead. They anticipated this move, and when the Wei forces launched their surprise attack, the Qin had already set a trap. The result was a devastating defeat for Wei, and their hopes of regaining control vanished. The message was clear: resistance against the Qin was futile. They didn't just win battles, they made sure the very idea of rebellion was stamped out. The state of Wei was the first to fall, but it wouldn't be the last. Now, remember, while all of this is going on, King Zheng is constantly in motion. He's not just sitting back and watching his generals do the work. He's in the thick of it, making decisions, motivating his people, and ensuring that the legalist policies of Li Si are being applied across every corner of the empire. The Qin were not just conquering, they were actively reshaping the societies they entered. And this is where the real genius of Qin's unification comes into play. The Qin didn't just take territory, they made sure their rule was absolute. This wasn't about maintaining the status quo. It wasn't about making peace treaties or establishing temporary alliances. No, the Qin were all about one thing: control. And that control extended beyond the military. Under King Zheng's leadership and Li Si's guidance, the Qin implemented sweeping reforms that eradicated any remnants of the old order. One of the most notable reforms was the imposition of a single legal code across the entire empire. This was a monumental shift from the way things had been done in the past. Before the Qin, each state had its own set of laws and customs, which created a fractured and disjointed society. But under Qin rule, everything was standardized. From taxes to property laws, there was no more room for ambiguity or regional variation. The legalist policies that Li Si championed made sure that everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, followed the same rules. And if you broke those rules, well, the consequences were severe. But while the legalist reforms were essential for the consolidation of power, it wasn't just the law that the Qin imposed. They also standardized weights, measures, and currency. This was a particularly clever move, as it not only brought economic stability but also made it much easier to administer such a vast empire. Imagine how chaotic things would have been if every region had different forms of money or measurement systems. It would have been near impossible to coordinate trade, taxes, or any other form of governance. By standardizing these systems, the Qin were ensuring that the empire ran like a well-oiled machine. And this wasn't just about governance, it was about the people. As Qin rule spread, so did their cultural influence. The Qin were methodical in their approach, establishing a uniform script across the empire. This made communication easier, which helped tie the disparate regions together. Think of it like the modern-day standardization of language. When everyone can communicate in the same way, it's easier to unite them under one banner. Back on the battlefield, the Qin were relentless. Having crushed Wei, they now set their sights on the next state, Zhao. Zhao was a formidable enemy, with a powerful army and a fierce reputation. But the Qin were no longer the underdogs. They had the momentum, and they had the resources to wage a protracted war. The Qin army, now battle-hardened from their previous conquests, moved swiftly, attacking Zhao with precision and efficiency. As they had done with Wei, the Qin began by isolating Zhao's defenses, targeting key military outposts and weakening supply lines. Zhao fought back fiercely, but they were outmatched. The Qin's overwhelming military strength and their ability to cut off reinforcements led to a swift victory. The state of Zhao, once one of the most powerful in China, was now just another chapter in the growing story of Qin dominance.